All right, let us start by reading the greatest verse in the Bible. Now, go ahead and I would honestly, there's two places in the Bible that we're going to reference over and over and over again. The first is 1 Peter 2:9, of course, and the second is Exodus 19:6. We're going to start by reading 1 Peter 2:9 because it kind of does both of those things. It both is 1 Peter 2:9 and it quotes Exodus 19:6. Technically, it's 9 and 10. So this is what it says in 1 Peter 2:9 and 10. It says, "But you are a chosen family, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. For you once were not a people, but now you are the people of God. You had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy." Now I think, let me see what I got here. Oh, we'll get there. This verse, I think, seems really simple on its face. The church is a royal priesthood. Peter here is talking to Christians that have been kind of scattered through the diaspora and specifically Asia Minor, and he is quoting Exodus 19:6, which was the statement of royal priesthood for ancient Israel, and is giving that charge to the church at large. In Exodus 19:5-6, God instructs Moses to tell the Israelites this. He says, "So now then, if you will indeed listen to my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." But I want to start off this lesson on individual priesthood by doing something that we haven't really done here. And that is, I just want to kind of go around and ask about what you guys think priesthood is. In Reformed circles specifically, it's a Protestant idea. We often have heard the term priesthood of all believers, or the individual priesthood of believers. That's how it was always said to me, as something that was passed down from the Reformation. And this concept is actually very important to Luther specifically. He's kind of the guy that got the ball rolling on the idea. More than most theologians, actually, Luther was less of a systematic theologian and more concerned with the life of a Christian. I would say, for my money, that Luther is probably the most pastoral of the reformers, at least like the major ones, and was more than any other reformer concerned with how to inspire his congregants to better Christian living specifically. So when Luther calls us priests in freedom of a Christian, he talks about it a little bit more in general terms. He does get into it a little specifically. But he has an eye towards the servitude and the love of others. We're going to get into what that is a little bit later. So with that kind of introduction, when you guys hear priesthood of the believer, what does that mean to you? Like what when you've heard that term, what do you think that means? Just out of curiosity. Yeah.
Somebody who leads a congregation.
So part of a congregation?
Somebody who leads.
Someone who leads a congregation? That's much more of a Catholic version of that. Yeah.
Someone appointed to be a representative of God's people.
Someone appointed to be a representative of God's people.
To God.
To
the priest who offered sacrifices, like that was their job specifically as appointed by God.
Okay. So when you guys hear, just out of curiosity, when you guys hear the term priesthood, you think of it in terms of the vocational priesthood of the Levites. Yes? Okay. And I would assume you would as well if the connection is more on the priest side. All right. That's good. That means that we have some stuff to learn, and I like that. So we are going to spend a lot of time looking at the concept of priesthood in the Old Testament. We are actually going to start with Adam, and we are going to work all the way through to the New Testament. And we're not even going to talk about Hebrews. That's a lie. We're definitely going to talk about Hebrews. So with that, let's go on kind of a globe-trotting adventure across the Bible and see how God addresses Israel in light of the priestly charge. And we will start with Adam. We are going to start with Adam because the Bible starts with Adam. And I think we can learn something about the role of priest from Adam himself. And honestly, we're going to spend some time in Genesis. Genesis is a really cool book. It's actually like a fun book, especially because we're going to talk about Leviticus and Deuteronomy too. So, biblical typology and symbolism is a really fun topic. But before we really get into a lot of the typology and symbolism here, I want to state up front that I don't want to take the typology too far. That is something I've seen a lot of people, especially in like covenantal realms, do, where it's very easy to find types and symbols when you're looking for them. So I want to offer the caveat that where the Bible does not one-for-one a typological or symbolic relationship, I don't want to dogmatically assert that there is one. However, I do think that many of these things are intentional. So I'll kind of, again, part of the individual priesthood of the believer is you guys ought to examine what we are learning in your own studies. So I would encourage you to, if you're interested in any of this, to continue to do your own research on it, and don't just take my word for it, don't just take the word of this presentation, but actually go and study some of these concepts and see if there's actually something to some of the symbology and typological arguments here. All right. The first thing I want to cover is how the Garden of Eden seems to typify the tabernacle and temple. In Genesis 2:6 and 2:8 and 2:10, we learn that God planted a garden in Eden, and that this garden is separate from Eden itself. That a river originates in Eden, goes into the garden, then splits into 4 parts to bring life to the rest of the world. I have up here kind of, I don't know if you guys can see this or not, but I have a kind of you can kind of see the physical correlation between the two things and how they're constructed. My only dislike of the tabernacle is that it should be facing east, and the one I had was facing up and down. Both of them have a gate to the east. That's actually how the tabernacle was constructed. But we see, let's see. The interesting thing about this, so when you break down the Garden of Eden and you compare it to the breakdown of the temple, there's a lot of things that are similar, right? So, like I said, both of them are facing east. The entrance to the tabernacle and the entrance to the Garden of Eden are both located on the east. They are both, the Garden of Eden itself and the Holy of Holies are the place where God is described as walking with his people. That word, when Adam sees God walking in the garden, is the same word that's used when God tells Moses that he will walk with the Israelites. Same word. We see that in Genesis 3:8. Just like the Holy of Holies was where God communed with the priests, so the Garden of Eden was where God came down and manifested himself physically to Adam and Eve. Let's see. There's also a parallel. So in Ezekiel 47, and I realize, by the way, we're going to be jumping through a lot of scriptures. I tried to make note of them, but if I put all of them on the slides, we would have had like 50 slides. So I apologize for that. But it's also worth noting that in Ezekiel 47, there's something called the house of Yahweh, which it's generally taken to refer to the temple of God, also located in the east with a gate facing east, has a river that flows out in 4 directions. In my opinion, that is the most obvious link between the temple and the Garden of Eden. To continue the typology, Eden itself represents the rest of the temple, and the outside world is the outside world. Mankind is described in Genesis 2:15 as being placed in the garden to cultivate and to keep it. Those are how it's translated in LSB. Those 2 Hebrew words are actually used of priests multiple times. So, for example, in Numbers 3:7-8, which I had to quote because Dan is always in my book, so I had to be in his. In Numbers 3:7-8, it says this: "And they shall keep his responsibility and the responsibility for the whole congregation before the tent of meeting to perform the service of the tabernacle." That word for keep and perform is the same thing as to keep and to it can be translated as guard. The word is samar. Those 2 words are the same words as in Genesis 2. And that pairing of words shows up at least 3 other times. I think it shows up a whole lot more than that. Other times in Numbers, and then other times in Ezekiel 44. All of this is meant to say that Adam is largely considered to be the first priest, and the garden is considered to be his temple. Adam was given the responsibility to maintain the garden and to guard it. So that, like I said, that word samar actually means to guard, like to keep in the sense of guarding, and to rule the rest of the world through procreation. When the serpent slithers its way into to Eden and deceives Eve, Adam's first failure is actually not taking of the fruit, but in not guarding the garden. This is the priestly duty that is given to Adam, given in conjunction with the kingly duty to rule. Not only is Adam supposed to maintain and guard the sanctuary where God communes with man, but he is to rule the rest of the world as well. I'm going to be focusing on the priestly aspect of God's people, but I do want to note that it is actually really difficult to separate the priestly function of man from the kingly function of man. Those two things are talked about almost entirely together. In fact, the three verses that talk about the priesthood of believers, which we generally would take to be Exodus 19:6, 1 Peter 2:9, and Revelation 1:6, those are the three verses that explicitly talk about the corporate priesthood of God's people. And all three of these refer to God's people as a priestly kingdom. I don't have all. We will talk about not Revelation because it's very similar to 1 Peter 2:9. But just if you want to learn more about this topic, those are the three verses really to look at in this regard. I take that to mean that God's design is that his kingly people also function as priests. So if we take this back to Adam, the kingly function is to rule and have dominion over the earth, while the priestly function is to maintain and keep the garden. In fact, if the garden is not maintained, then the dominion of the earth cannot happen, which is a way of saying that if communion with God is broken, his people are not receiving the blessing to go and have dominion. After the fall, mankind is cursed by being removed from that communion and by making earthly subjugation nigh impossible. Both childbearing and working the ground, two things made easy in the garden prior to the fall, when removed from the place of communion, become very difficult. So, on a basic level, what we learn from Adam is that the priest of God keeps God's commandment, maintains God's sanctuary, and communes with God so that he can go out into the world with God's blessing. Do I actually have a slide on this? I probably should be on that slide. Now, would you believe it if I told you that this charge to Adam to subdue the world not only passes on to Noah, but it actually passes on to Abraham? I feel like I'm skipping Noah a little bit. What I would do is, if you are interested in this topic, Genesis 8 and the beginning of Genesis 9 are almost word for word copy of the charge to Adam to have dominion, to subdue the earth, and to multiply. Like, all three of those things are also given to Noah. Noah then sacrifices on an altar, which is kind of a temporary commune place with God. But so Noah's kind of a restatement of the charge to Adam, and then we move on to Abraham. So in Genesis 12, we see also a version of this charge given to Abram, where if Abram goes into the promised land, God will bless all families of the earth in Genesis 12:3. Just like with Noah and with Adam, the promise to give Abram the land is accompanied by the building of an altar, which happens in Genesis 12:7. Right? Keeping in mind that all of these missiological ideas, to go into a different land, given the mission to go into a land, or given a mission to have dominion over the earth, is always accompanied with some kind of communing with God. There's an altar when God gives his covenant to Noah, and there's an altar in Genesis 12 when God gives the covenant to Abraham, or at least gives that promise to Abraham. The covenant's not actually given until Genesis 15. There's a lot there. I also probably verge on a little bit of self-indulgence because I find this stuff a lot more interesting than probably the average person does. But all of that to say that the concept of priesthood, as it is with Adam and as it is with Noah and as it is with Abraham, is kind of leaving Melchizedek out of the picture, which is what we're going to do because that's its own kind of can of worms. The concept of priesthood as it is with those three of the pre-Mosaic Israelite fathers, it pretty much stays the same until Exodus 19. And that's when God meets Moses on Sinai. I gotta keep up with this, right? Yeah. When God meets Moses on Sinai and lays out the law. And specifically, he actually gives all of the instructions for how to build the tabernacle, how to build all the garments, and all of that stuff. And that word for work and keep is given in relationship to the tabernacle, which is where they minister to the people of Israel and minister to God, so that the people of Israel are right before God, so that they can move into the land that was promised to Abraham. This calling in Exodus 19:6 relates Israel both to God and to the other nations. And this is kind of one of the major themes of this discussion I want you guys to keep in mind. At this point, we haven't quite seen God tell Israel directly that they are going to be priests to other nations, but they are priests compared to other nations. In particular, Exodus 19 focuses on God fighting against Israel's enemy on their behalf if they fulfill their roles as priest kings. Do I have 19:6 here? I don't. This would be a good time to open Exodus 19:6 if you want to. And Deuteronomy 4:5-8. Actually, I'm going to read Deuteronomy 4:5-8 because we'll come to Exodus 19:6. The focus on Israel's mission and priests is probably most evident in Deuteronomy 4:5-8, in addition to 19:6. So this is what God says to Israel in Deuteronomy 4:5-8. It says, "See, I have taught you statutes and judgments, just as Yahweh my God commanded you." This is Moses talking to the people. "Just as Yahweh my God commanded me, that you should do thus in the land where you are entering to possess it. You shall keep and do them, for that is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of people who will hear all these statutes and say, 'Surely this great nation is wise and understanding people.' For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as is Yahweh our God whenever we call on him? Or what great nation is there that has statutes and judgments as righteous as this whole law which I am setting before you today?" Not only, this is again in Deuteronomy 4, not only is God to be revered amongst Israel, but amongst the nations that they see. This is an echo of the charge to Abram in Genesis 12 that all families of the earth would be blessed in God's walking with Abram. This is primarily a call to separate between the holy and profane, as evidenced in Leviticus 10-11. Again, I don't know if I have that verse on here, but that's another big one for this. And Leviticus 20:24-26. The mission statement here is also restated in Deuteronomy 24:9-10, where God once again tells the Israelites that their following him will result in the nations fearing him. All of this to say that the corporate priesthood of Israel is definitively missiological. Not only are they to worship God themselves, but they are to inspire the nations to a fear and reverence of God as well. This becomes more clear in later books in the Old Testament when we see other positive and negative results of righteousness and judgments, or results of unrighteousness. The first is going to be in Joshua 2:9-11. This is when the spies are in Jericho and Rahab takes them in, and she reports to the spies that Jericho and the nation around it is terrified of God, and that all in the land have melted away before the Israelites. It is on that basis, in fact, that Rahab agrees to help them. She even states that she believes God is capable of basically wrecking Jericho and saving her and her family in the process. She basically forces them to swear that they will keep her safe. The second one I would say to look at here is 1 Kings 8:41-43. This is actually a really interesting passage just from a covenantal perspective. But in this passage, Solomon is praying, is I believe the prayer for the dedication of the temple. And he says, and when in that prayer in verses 41-43, he prays for the foreigner who will, quote, "hear of your great name and your strong hand and of your outstretched arms." And on that basis, Solomon asks if God will hear their prayers. The statement is fulfilled in the Queen of Sheba episode, which is in 1 Kings 10, who says to Solomon this. She says, "Blessed be Yahweh your God who delighted in you to set you on the throne of Israel, because Yahweh loved Israel forever. Therefore he made you king to do justice and righteousness." So those are the first two. The third is the story of Jonah. Now, there is some questions as to how literal the story of Jonah should be taken. That's not really important, but what is important from this story in regards to what we're talking about is that there is at the very least a focus of God on other nations other than Israel. And we're going to get into that too when we talk about the unrighteousness. But Jonah is actually sent to Assyria, to Nineveh, which was the capital of Assyria. So that is kind of the importance there. It's also worth noting that Obadiah is written against the Edomites and Nahum is also written against the Ninevites. In both cases, God holds them accountable for infractions against him. which implies that one way or another they were familiar with God's commandments. Unfortunately, that's about as much as we learn from the corporate priesthood regarding how Israel interacts positively with other nations. Unfortunately, the story of the priesthood in Israel is, generally speaking, a negative one. We're not even going to get into the failures of the vocational priesthood. That's its own thing. Generally speaking, there's two ways that God discusses failure with the Israelites. There's the priests failed, which caused the people to fail, and then there's just flat out condemnation of the people. There's a bunch of verses here. As God's people, Israel they were charged with bringing his fame to the whole world. And in some cases, they did elucidate his standard of holiness enough for people like the Queen of Sheba to understand it, enough for foreign nations like Edom and Assyria to be judged for not adhering to God's law. But most of what we learn from the corporate priesthood is how Israel fails to be the nation of priest kings. I'd say Amos is one of the books that's probably at the forefront to look at here. The first two chapters of Amos are mostly concerned with God judging the foreign nations. Moab, Ammon, Tyre, Gaza, Edom, and Damascus all take shots of punishment from God on account of transgressions that they have made. And then at the end of that, in chapter 3, Amos is given the following judgment of Israel. This is from Amos, the beginning of Amos 3, says, "You only have I known among all the families of the earth, therefore I will punish you for all your iniquities." And this judgment is pronounced, at least symbolically, in the sight of all of those other nations that have also been judged. This sentiment is also recounted in Ezekiel 36, 20 through 21, which says this. It says, "Then they came to the nations to which they came, and they profaned my holy name, because it was said of them, 'These are the people of Yahweh, yet they have come out of his land.' But I had concern for my holy name, which the house of Israel had profaned among the nations where they went." In fact, this lack of concern for his own holy name and its sight amongst the nations is actually the basis of much of God's judgment of Israel. Hosea 4 through 7 connects this specifically to the priestly action of Israel. We're going to actually read like verses 4 through 10. Starting in verse 4, it says, "Yet let no man contend, and let no man offer reproof. Indeed, your people are like those who contend with the priest. So you will stumble by day, and the prophet also will stumble with you by night, and I will destroy your mother. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I will also reject you from ministering as my priest. Since you have forgotten the law of your God, I myself will also forget your children." As Hosea goes on, it becomes clear that Israel has failed in their kingly roles to have dominion in Yahweh's name, because they have failed in their priestly duties of maintaining the sanctuary of God. And this is the following verses that makes that, in my opinion, very clear, where it says, "The more they multiplied, the more they sinned against me. I will change their glory into disgrace. They eat the sin of my people and lift up their soul towards their iniquity. And it will be like people, like priests. So I will punish them for their ways and cause their deeds to return to them." So they have multiplied, as was commanded of Adam. It says, "The more they've multiplied, the more they've sinned against me." But this has also multiplied their sin because they have rejected the knowledge of God and have forgotten to keep the law of God as was commanded the Israelites. Now, again, I realize that we're talking about a lot of prophecy, and this might come off as a little bit dry if you're not me, which I, again, apologize for. But I do hope that this highlights the priestly and kingly status of Israel. Even if we haven't talked about specifically what their role is in terms of ministering to people in a priestly fashion, it is important to understand that God calls Israel priests. And we get a lot of information on what vocational priests are supposed to do. And we know what it looks like when Israel fails. So with that, we should ask the question, how exactly did Israel fail? In what specific ways did they fail? And to that answer, we haven't talked much about vocational priests because this lesson is not really about vocational priests. In fact, when we talk about the priesthood of the believer, we're actually specifically not talking about vocational priests. That was kind of the big distinction in the Reformation, was between vocational priests and the individual priest of all believers. So we're not talking about vocational priests even in the sense of Israel, but it's also true that there's a correlation between the Israel's vocational priests and the corporate priests of the nation. So we are going to look at what that is. So the way I see the role of vocational priests in Israel is twofold, And really it's onefold with two directions. The first is that priests mediated between God and man, and the second is that priests communicated between man and God. Right? One is to bring judgment from God towards man, and one is to bring petition from man to God. Those are really the two roles of the priest, and they might seem the same, but again, the difference is kind of in direction, and they actually had somewhat differing responsibilities. God always takes on the role of ruler in all of his dealings with the people. He's always taking on the role of ruler and judge. And man is always taking on the role of subjects. When man tries to take on a different role, as Nahab and Abihu do by playing around with incense, for example, there are dire consequences. Nahab and Abihu get burned up. Let's quickly look at the different roles of vocational priests in the nation of Israel. The first way that priests work is in the realm of mediation between God and man. One thing to note here is the Urim and Thummim. It is not exactly clear what the Urim and Thummim were, but Numbers 21:27 describes how Eleazar receives God's judgment through that tool. In fact, regarding judgments in general, God gives the laws to the priests, such as Moses and Aaron, who then pass these on to the people. I don't want to talk too much about the concept of high priest. There doesn't really seem to be a concept of high priest until much later in Israel's history. But Aaron is generally considered the first high priest. I will say that Moses is talked about in Hebrews 3 as being compared to Jesus, who is the high priest. And Moses was the one to whom God directly gave the 10 Commandments, and then Moses then gave those to the people. There's not really in the Old Testament a separation between prophet and priest. Those roles seem to be distinct a lot later on. Further, Moses often intercedes for the Israelites, which is a role generally seen in the priest when the Israelites sin. In fact, it is something of a recurring theme in the Pentateuch for Israel to do something wrong, and then for Moses to basically ask God and seek reconciliation on their behalf on the basis of the covenant that they had established. This kind of intercession is similar to the sacrifices that Aaron and the sons offered, in that both instances serve as a kind of request for propitiation and atonement, or at least forgiveness in one way or another. In this way, the priests were kind of like prophets. Like I said, most authors see the role of priest breaking down into different roles between prophet and priest much later in time, probably starting with Samuel. In the original Aaronic, like the Aaron-based priesthood, the role of the priest was both to deliver God's laws and judgments to the people, in addition to their other kind of maintenance duties regarding the temple and sacrifices and all that. Leviticus 10, we're going to get into Leviticus 10 now. Leviticus 10, 8 through 11 states this. It says, Yahweh then spoke to Aaron, saying, "Do not drink wine or strong drink, neither you nor your sons with you, when you come into the tent of meeting, so that you will not die. It is a perpetual statute throughout your generations, and so as to separate between the holy and profane, and between the unclean and the clean, and so as to instruct the sons of Israel in all the statutes which Yahweh has spoken to them through Moses." As mediator between God and man, only priests were allowed beyond the court of the tabernacle. God often describes Aaron and his sons as being set apart for the work of the priesthood, even telling Aaron that it is a privilege, to the point where Levi is not actually, if you recall Israel's history, Levi is not actually given any land as an inheritance, and Deuteronomy 10:8, 10:9 specifies that Levi's inheritance is their communing with God. By God's admission, they're the most blessed of the tribes, specifically because they are the ones who actively communed with and ministered to God. So in this sense, Levi, the priestly tribe, was also meant to be the dignitaries of formal worship as designed by God. The reverse is also true if we look at it from man's perspective. Levi represented God to man, but also represented man to God. Not only are they the ones who worship God in the tabernacle itself, at least in the holy place and the most holy place, but they are the ones who atone for Israel through the sacrificial system. So to summarize the role of the priesthood, they were to bring God to the people and bring the people to God. That would be the pithy way of saying that. Ultimately, I think that's the most telling statement regarding the corporate priesthood. There are, of course, diminishing returns depending on how far away you get from the actual communing with God itself. The Levites, the priestly tribe, is more blessed than the rest of Israel, specifically because they are the closest in their direct communion with God. we should expect that this continues from Israel to the foreign nations too. That is, where the Levites had more direct access to God through their priestly functions, so Israel had more direct access to God than the foreign nations who saw God in Israel's midst. The job of the Levites was to bring God to the rest of Israel. The job of Israel was to bring God to the rest of the world. We rarely see, what do I have going on? We rarely see what this is supposed to look like in the Old Testament. The closest we get is probably that glimpse from 1 Kings 8 to 10, from the time Solomon prays to God on behalf of the foreigners to the time that the Queen of Sheba pronounces a blessing upon God in chapter 10. That's the only time where Israel is proselytizing people without subjugating them through warfare and without use of like straight up fear. Sheba's blessing is filled with reverence and awe at the works that God has done, and even states that Solomon's kingship is subservient to God's ruling over Israel. I'd say other than that, if we really want to see what it looks like to have a proper priesthood, like a corporate priesthood in action, the closest that we get is kind of a utopic view of that in Isaiah 56. If I can get there. Yeah. Well, that didn't turn out the way it was supposed to. This is the longest verse reading I have in the entire thing. This is from Isaiah 56, 1 through 8. So if you don't want to read over the white text, it wasn't like that when I made it, but if you want to read it yourself along, it's Isaiah 56. It says this, thus says Yahweh, keep justice and do righteousness, for my salvation is about to come, and my righteousness to be revealed. How blessed is the man who does this, and the Son of Man who takes hold of it, who keeps from profaning the Sabbath, and keeps his hand from doing any evil. Let not the foreigner who has joined himself to Yahweh say, Yahweh will surely separate me from his people. Nor let the eunuch say, behold, I am a dry tree. For thus says Yahweh, to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who choose what pleases me, and hold fast to my covenant, to them I will give in my house and within my walls a memorial, and a name better than that of sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name which will not be cut off. Also the foreigners who join themselves to Yahweh, to minister to him, and to love the name of Yahweh, to be his slaves, everyone who keeps from profaning the Sabbath and takes hold of my covenant, even those I will bring to my holy mountain, and make them glad in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be acceptable on my altar, for my house will be called a house of prayer for all the peoples. Lord Yahweh, who gathers the banished of Israel, declares, yet others will I gather to them, to those already gathered. I just find that to be like a beautiful picture of ultimately what the church is supposed to look like. But of note here for our discussion is when Isaiah describes foreigners coming and ministering or serving to Yahweh in verse 6, it is the same word used to describe Aaron's work in the tabernacle. For example, as it's laid out in Exodus 28:43. Exodus 28:43 says this. It says, they shall be on Aaron and his sons when they come into the tent of meeting or when they approach the altar to minister in the holy place so that they do not incur guilt and die. That word for minister is the same word used in Isaiah 56 to describe what will happen when foreigners come to worship at the house of prayer. It seems that Isaiah 56 has in view the kind of service that the foreigners under the covenant will be working ministry for God is similar in fashion to what Aaron was doing as a ministry for God's tabernacle. So thus far we have spent a long time discussing Old Covenant priests and their role, whether it's vocational or corporate. And thus far I think we have seen, really, if we can narrow it down to two things. One, that the vocational priests really are there to help the corporate priests fulfill their priestly duty throughout the world and their kingly duty throughout the world. And two, I hope, if I've done my job, if I've been focused enough, I hope that we've seen the ultimate goal is for the name of the Lord to be made known throughout the nation, throughout all of the nations, via the priestly service in Israel. And in fact, it is their failure to do this that causes God to punish them. In fact, the word profane is usually done in opposition to like praising the name, right? Profaning is the opposite of praising. I belabor this point, and we spent most of this presentation up to this point on this for this reason, that the concept of individual priesthood of the believer is not a light concept that is just randomly thrown into 1 Peter. It is a freedom from the world, but it is a service and it is a responsibility. The New Testament sheds a lot of light on what corporate priesthood under the new covenant allows us to do, but it all starts with personal responsibility. The priesthood was given to Israel with the charge not just to worship him, but to worship him correctly and to worship him in a way that his name is not profaned among the nations. And that is your charge, little priest. That is your charge too. We will discuss how to do that momentarily, but understand that just as Israel had their charge, as Christians, you have your charge too. And your charge is to serve God by worshiping him in such a way that he is not profaned among the nations. If you take nothing else away from this lesson, at least take that away. In fact, when Peter mentions that the church is a royal priesthood, again, this is a direct quote from Exodus 19:6. He follows it up by saying this to the Christians scattered in the Gentile nations. I don't think I have this up here. This is from 1 Peter 2. Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from fleshly lusts, which wage war against the soul by keeping your conduct excellent among the Gentiles, so that in the thing which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good works as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation. See, even Peter sees the calling of the corporate priesthood to be a call to glorify God in such a way that all the nations see that, and it inspires them to also turn and glorify God. But I don't want to leave it at that. See, we all have the task of doing that before us, but we're not without divine blessing, and we're not without tools. So you made the statement like I said I wasn't going to be in Hebrews, and you were like, really? And I was like, nah, I'm totally lying. This is the point at which we're going to get into Hebrews, because Hebrews 10 offers insight into Jesus' priestly ministry and what that means for us. This is from Hebrews 10. Do I have Hebrews 10 up here? I don't remember if I do, man. We'll leave it here. This is from Hebrews 10. Let's see. And every priest stands daily ministering and offering time after time the same sacrifice, which can never take away sins. But he, after having offered one sacrifice for sins for all time, sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from that time until his enemies are put as a footstool for his feet. For by one offering he has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. And the Holy Spirit also testifies to us. For after saying, this is the covenant that I will make with them, after those days, says the Lord, I will put my laws upon their heart, and on their mind I will write them. He then says, and their sins and their lawless deeds I will remember no more. Now where there is forgiveness of these things, there is no longer any offering for sin. And it's worth noting that after that, I believe it is right after that in Hebrews 10, the author follows up with this exhortation. Because of that, so think of it this way, because of what he just said here, because Jesus is serving as our high priest, having made a sacrifice once and for all time, because of the forgiveness of sins that results of that, therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way which he inaugurated for us through the veil, that is his flesh, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a sincere heart and full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds, not forsaking our own assembling together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. Now, I picked Hebrews to preach through at this church, and I don't know how I'm going to preach through Hebrews 10 when I get there, because it's just there's so much there. But I'm going to break down this section a little bit here by we're going to look at three elements. What I have here on the screen is three priestly elements. Because I think that whether or not these words are used or these elements are broken out in a way that is defined super intensely in Hebrews 10, I think it does lay out the blueprint for what our priestly work consists of. So the first element of the priesthood that I want to talk about is a word that I've kind of shied away from saying thus far because I didn't want to spoil the ending, but it's the word access. I think I brought it up once earlier. I've neglected to say it because I didn't want to spoil the ending. The word access is not a common word in the Bible. It only shows up like 3 times in the entire Bible. And it's a concept that is very obviously present here in Hebrews 10. It is also present in Hebrews 4, where Jesus' work as the high priest is the basis on which we, quote, boldly approach the throne of grace. That's Hebrews 4:16, so that we can receive mercy and find grace in times of temptation. This is also a statement. The word access actually shows up in both Ephesians 2 and Ephesians 3. Specifically in Ephesians 2, Paul refers to our access to God the Father through the Spirit. This is from Ephesians 2. For he himself is our peace, who made both groups one and broke down the dividing wall of partition by abolishing in his flesh the enmity, the law of commandments contained in ordinances, so that in himself he might create the two into one new man, making peace, and might reconcile them both in one body to God through the cross, having in himself put to death the enmity. And he came and preached the good news of peace to you who were far away, and peace to those who were near, for through him we both have our access in one Spirit to the Father. One of the interesting things when you start going into like a biblical theology of any given concept is you start wondering to what extent the biblical authors were relying on imagery used in the Old Testament. The concept of access is again, it's such a unique concept that it's hard not to think of, for example, Esther 1. In Esther 1, there's the wise men who knew law and justice, and they were permitted access to the king's presence in the royal court. The same idea is kind of brought up in Zechariah 3 when God tells the high priest Joshua, he says, if you will walk in my ways and if you will keep the responsibility given by me, then you will also render justice in my house and also keep my courts, and I will grant you access to walk among those who are standing here. Is this episode where God gives the high priest the prophecy of the branch through whom God will forgive the nation of Israel. Regardless, so again, there's always the temptation to read something like the word access in Ephesians 2 or Ephesians 3 and to read back into it kind of the same kind of access that they refer to when they're talking about the throne room, whether that's the divine throne room in Zechariah 3 or the throne room of the king in Esther 1. I always think that there is a temptation to do that, and I would go as far to say I wouldn't be surprised if that is the intent. But again, just with the caveat that I'm not trying to dogmatically assert any of this, but I do find that to be kind of an interesting corollary and idea. Through the Spirit, on the basis of the work in Jesus, we have access to the throne room of God. It is on this basis in Ephesians 3 that Paul prays his famous doxology that ends with, we quote this at church all the time. It says, now to him who is able to do far more abundantly beyond all that we ask or understand, according to the power that works within us, to him be the glory in the church and in Christ Jesus to all generations forever and ever. Amen. That doxology is preceded by an acknowledgement of our access to the Father. This access gives us strength because we can approach him in prayer through the intercession of the Spirit. And it is beyond this lesson to get into what prayer is and what it is meant to do. This has become something that I have recently become a lot more passionate about looking into. Those of you who have been here a while might remember that Paul Lee taught a lesson on prayer. For our purposes, I want to focus just on prayer as an act of worship. Revelation 5:8 and Revelation 8:3 describe the prayers of the saints as being incense. The incense, again, it describes the prayers as being incense. I'm going to look at that symbol and what that might imply about prayer. Again, I don't want to state that dogmatically, but keep in mind this is a symbol that goes back to Exodus 19 and 20 and 21. It goes back to the whole laying out of that system in the Old Testament. The incense in the Old Testament was to be offered continually right in front of the mercy seat of the tabernacle. Again, there's danger in reading too much into symbols, but if we understand the altar of incense being related to the altar of prayer, Paul's command to pray continually kind of takes on a new meaning. At least that's how I feel about it. Well, if incense was meant to be offered continually and prayers related to incense, then Paul saying to pray continually is almost like us offering incense continually the same way it would have been in the tabernacle. The Israelites were commanded to burn incense at the altar at all times. Now, again, we are not under the priesthood, we are not under the old priesthood, we're under the priesthood of Christ. So the physical institution of the tabernacle is gone, But can our prayers not still be offered continuously as the incense was? It is worth noting that the New Testament is not shy about using Old Testament imagery to color our understanding of New Testament worship. God has not changed. Why would we expect that his preferred method of spiritual worship has changed? So in our access to God, we ought to pray with fervency and with reverence, but with boldness in the work of Christ and in the intercession of the Spirit. In Romans 8 describes the Spirit interceding on our behalf with groanings that are too great for words. We have been granted access to the royal throne room, and we take advantage of that to offer praise and to intercede on behalf of both of the other saints, as the author says in Hebrews 10, and for the rest of the world, as Jesus commands in Matthew 5:44 regarding those who seek us harm, and as Paul commands Timothy in 1 Timothy 2:1 regarding all kinds of people. All kinds of people. All kinds, not just all people. A quick note on prayer. Remember that the structure of Israel's worship is that the priests commune with God and then bring the people of the world back to God. There are strikingly few verses where we are commanded to pray specifically for unbelievers, and a large number of verses where we are told to pray for people to be sent to minister to unbelievers that they may be saved. The implication to me here is not that we shouldn't pray for unbelievers, but that prayer is an act of worship that benefits the priest more than it benefits the unsaved person. Is kind of what I take away from that. Paul echoes this in Philippians 4. I know I have something on this here. Yeah. Paul echoes this in Philippians 4, 6 through 7, where he says, "Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and your minds in Jesus Christ." James 5 also exhorts his audience to pray for believers who are suffering and or sick, and then it kind of caps that section off in verse 16 by saying, the effective prayer of a righteous man can accomplish much. So, again, I'm not saying that we should not pray for the unsaved. I'm saying that the benefit of prayer is rooted more in how it affects the church and stirs up the church to go and make disciples, as opposed to having any direct effect on the unsaved person itself. Prayer is more like the lifeblood that gives us the strength to fulfill our priestly duties. Again, I would love to do a lesson on prayer, kind of more of a theology behind it someday. Much of the problem that Calvin had with the Catholic Church was in how they the Catholic Church restricted one's ability to be a Christian to their attendance of Mass. Christians were people who were baptized, who were confirmed, partook in the Eucharist, and partook in the sacramental system in general. But the burden of one's Christian life was never meant to be rooted in the organization of the church. By which I mean it doesn't stem from the organization of the church. The church, the community of believers, the universal church, is a helpful tool without which a Christian will struggle. In fact, both the Old Testament and the New Testament, priestly service and worship is a corporate affair. All of the festivals, all the related sacrifices, those are all corporate events. Similarly, James, for example, instructs everyone to interact with each other with love and prayer. And this call to interact corporately is mentioned in literally almost every epistle. But the responsibility to follow the commands of God is not something that is always carried out corporately. Jeremiah 31, which, by the way, Hebrews 10 quotes, mentions how God will no longer hold people responsible for their sin on a familial or corporate level. That's in verses 31, 29 through 30. And he then says that they will not teach again each man his neighbor and each man his brother, saying, "Know Yahweh, for they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them," in verse 34. The tablets of stone from which the Israelites derived their law has been done away with and replaced with the law being written on our hearts through the Spirit. Again, this is not the purpose of the lesson, but I think that some interesting points can be made about the purpose of the body of believers by understanding the biblical concept of the priesthood. There is a growing movement, I think it's growing, maybe it's shrinking, in the Baptist church, among others, that kind of cheapens the organization of church entirely. I'm gonna do a series of quotes. I think I have them here. I don't know why I have that first. There's a series of quotes I'm going to have. The first is from a pastor named Cecil Sherman, who bemoaned in a sermon that pastors of the church would be the ones to write the statement of faith. He has a problem with pastors being the right to the church's statement of faith, since that denies the efficacy, in his opinion, of the priesthood of all believers. He says this, he says, "Who is the authoritarian that would tell the laity what they must believe or think? What made the pastor so great, so wise? Does God commune with the pastor and not with us?" And then he goes on, he complains, "Some Baptists are more Catholic in their practice than some Catholics are these days." This Nancy Ammerman here takes this issue to the next level when she describes the ideal Baptist church as one where, quote, "the congregation itself, ordinary people and not the elites, do the work of the church and respond to God as they feel led." Then she praises the early Baptist church because, quote, "Baptist ideas and practices challenge the very basis of established authority. If there was no special people with special rights and duties in the matter of religion, there might not be special people in any other areas of life either." What this ends up becoming is a polemic against church structure. In fact, James Scott, who is another one of these guys, he cautions Baptists against taking any denominational positions at all, lest it divide us. He says this, he says, quote, "The issue at Galatia was circumcision. Today, the issue may be abortion or welfare rights or biblical inerrancy. But when we declare a position, are we boxing God into that position?" He continues later, "I often pray that God will deliver us from the agony of conceiving and shaping resolutions. The ideal is to provide each believer with facts and establish the range of possible positions, then set the believer free to be guided by the Holy Spirit towards a decision." Now, all three of these, it might seem like they're getting more extreme over time. I just want you to know all three of these were pulled from the same book of sermons that was edited by the same person. So this is not just like I went and cherry picked things from different people. This is actually all in the same book that was called Proclaiming the Baptist Vision, a Priesthood of All Believers. So this is something that there is at the very least, a large enough group of Baptists to write a whole book on the topic and push it in that direction. And with all due respect to Mr. Scott, I think his ideas are absolutely terrible. And the idea that the individual priesthood means not judging others by taking a hardline stance on social issues, not seeking out authority on matters of theology, or as Miss Ammerman eventually states, not loving, or what she basically says, throw in our lot with the outcasts, on the basis of their outcastness, that we are to identify with outcasts because Baptists were at one point outcasts. I don't think that is all biblical. There's nothing wrong with ministering to outcasts. I'm not saying we should ignore people who are outcasts of society, but to kind of revel in the outcastness doesn't seem to be the biblical prerogative here. It is unwise to say that the Bible does not have definitive answers on things. It is unwise to deny the authority of those who are stronger in the faith and have been called to a vocation in the church. The body has different servants and it has different roles, and one of those roles includes ecclesiastical authority in some way. To their point, the individual does not have the charge to be, the individual does have the charge to be God's priest, to take the secular and bring it to the holy. That kind of cultural engagement is something we're actually we have a lesson on that next season that we're going to be talking about. So I'm not going to get in, spoiler, but we will talk about that in more depth next season. But, and I want to make this clear, the existence of the church as an institution does not deny our individual responsibility. Philippians 2:12-13 says this, "Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Or it is God who works in you both the will and to work for his good pleasure." God works in us, but God works in us. We still have work to do. If we didn't, then Paul wouldn't end all of his letters with an exhortation to do good deeds. Let us also recall the Bereans in Acts 17:11, who were more noble than the Thessalonians because they were examining the scriptures even when they were receiving inspired teaching from Paul himself. And they still went and examined Paul's words against the scriptures. And that's the other aspect of responsibility here. We must read God's word. Remember how Hosea 4 condemned Israel for rejecting the knowledge of God? God instructs Hosea to marry a prostitute as an allegory for Israel's spiritual harlotry. When we say that Israel rejected the knowledge of God, we mean that Israel rejected an intimacy with God that other nations were not able to have. We have the knowledge of God. We have the access of intimacy through both his word and through other acts of worship and through prayer. Paul specifies that Israel had an initial, hold on, now I'm messing myself up because I put this on top, had an initial advantage regarding righteousness because they had the Old Testament and the revealed law. We just don't have the burden of that law, and the inability to fulfill it doesn't bring us guilt. Our ability to know God is not limited to the ceremonial system anymore. We have God's very word in the Bible, and we have a direct line of communication through both the words therein and through prayer. If you want to know God, if you want to have an intimacy with God, if you want to do God's good works, you need to pray and you need to read God's word. And the church as an organization is a gift from God to help guide the believers into a deeper knowledge of God's character. As priests of God, it is our duty to learn God and to know God. In fact, it is our primary duty to know God, because knowing him leads us to do all of this other service, the prayer, the love of others, the reading of God's word. J.I. Packer has this in a short statement in his book, Knowing God. He says this, he says, once you become aware that the main business that you are here for is to know God, most of life's problems fall into place of their own accord. Our main business is to know God, and everything else stems from that. And now we're going to retroactively go back to page 13, because that was how it was always meant to be. It's not your fault. I don't know how it fell out, honestly.
No, I took it out.
Why did you do that?
Because it was going to be a prank, and then I was like, oh, you know what? That's a really stupid idea. I thought it was a stupid idea, and then I was like, oh, I should give this to John before he starts, and then you started. And
Yeah.
Well, I'll find a way to slip it in. I'll start.
So the third element of the third priestly element that I want to talk about is the element of sacrifice.
Second element.
I know it's the second element, but I talked about two already, so technically it's the third one. The author of Hebrews says this in Hebrews 13:14 through 16. For here we do not have a lasting city, but we are seeking the one to come. Through him, then, let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God. That is the fruit of the lips that confess his name. Do not neglect doing good and sharing, for with such sacrifices God is pleased. Now, when we're talking about sacrifices, I do think that this can include prayer, which we talked about. But I think Romans 12:1 through 2 helps clarify when he says this. He says, therefore, I exhort you, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a sacrifice, living, holy, and pleasing to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may approve what the will of God is, that which is good and pleasing and perfect. He then lays out commands to the church, such as serving in relation to the spiritual gift that you have been given, being devoted to each other in brotherly love, abhorring what is evil, and the rest of the stuff. In other words, obeying God's commands is a sacrifice of praise and is part of our spiritual service. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Right? After all, the job given to Aaron in Leviticus 10 was to distinguish holy and unholy and instruct the sons of Israel in the statutes that God had given them. Therefore, while we have no condemnation under the Mosaic law, we still have the duty to obey God's commands to separate between the holy and the profane. 1 John 2:3 says, we know we have come to know God because we obey his commands. And Jesus explains in Matthew 5:16 that obeying God's commands leads people to see those good deeds and glorify our Father who is in heaven. I knew I talked about Luther somewhere in this presentation. This is the element that Luther mostly focuses on in his book, Freedom of a Christian. He basically opens up his books with a paradox that Christians are A, both lords over all, and B, servants to all. In the first case, we are little priest kings who fulfill the Adamic command to have dominion over the earth. And in the latter case, we dominate through our love of mankind, through a love that seeks to serve others. The service is, even in Luther's words, a sacrifice. We sacrifice our pride. We sacrifice our sinful desires for the sake of the body and ultimately for the kingdom itself. And at this point, normally I would have gone into our third element here, which, if I remember correctly, was duty. But we've already covered that. So I am going to show you this J.I. Packer quote, which is what I initially was going to end on. And then we are going to pray and end the lesson.